You're listening to Big World Network.
Just Kill Me, Season 2, Episode 3, Escape. Written by Wendy Herman. Read by Wendy Herman. The two young men were still arguing just outside the door to the small building I was being held captive in. I was chained to the wall and needed to not be. I had to coax those boys inside somehow. "Come into my parlor," said the spider to the flies. "Listen, gentlemen," I started, interrupting their bickering. "My back is killing me. Can I get one of those bar stools to sit on?" I motioned toward the two stools near the ice cream bar, covered in cobwebs. They just stared at me for a second. Then the smaller one nudged the other. "She's talking to you, Jax." "Shut up, Case." I noticed the bigger one's thigh wound was now soaking through the makeshift bandage, and he was getting paler by the minute. I had to make this happen fast. "Seriously, boys, I have a bad back. Leftovers from having my last baby. Just slide one of those stools over here, please." I was hoping that mentioning my children would appeal to something inside of them, some compassionate part buried deep in their memories. I mean, they had to have mothers, right? I had a fleeting thought that Hitler and Jeffrey Dahmer both had mothers too, but I quickly dismissed it. Doubt would not help me escape. Neither one of them moved. I switched gears slightly. "I'm really sorry about your leg," I said with as much genuine concern as I could muster. He looked down at his bleeding thigh, and I swear his face instantly grew one shade whiter. I really didn't want him to die. He was just a kid. "I'm not a doctor, but I have bandaged a cut or two in my day. You need a clean bandage, and you need to wrap it really tight. You're losing too much blood." "Come on, kid. You want Mommy to kiss your boo-boo and make it all better, don't you?" His friend was now looking at me with glossy eyes. It was working on him, at least. I kept going. "You look pale. Please, let me help you." My concern was genuine now. He was as white as a ghost and was leaning against the doorframe for support. I decided I had to take charge of the situation if I was going to save him. I pointed to the other delinquent. "You, Case, bring him here. He doesn't have much time." I was surprised when Case immediately did exactly what I'd said. The dying boy, Jax, didn't protest either. Case helped Jax sit down, propped up against the wall right next to where my chain was secured, but he looked like he would pass out at any second. Case just squatted next to his friend. "Brother?" I suddenly noticed a family resemblance in their faces. They had the same nose and chin. Good, that could only help my situation. I kneeled back down on the floor and moved to unwrap the bloody bandage, when I realized my palms still had blood on them. "Do you have anything I can clean my hands with?" I asked Jax, urgency apparent in my voice. He looked to be in shock and just shook his head ever so slightly. I don't think he could have told me his name at that point. I looked around the room. I noticed the outline of a sink in the dark corner I hadn't noticed before. If it was still hooked up to a water line... "Case," he looked at me like a frightened little boy as I spoke. "I need to get to the sink to wash my hands. Do you have the key for this chain?" His eyes grew wider at this, as if he was remembering I was supposed to be a prisoner. He was close enough for me to grab his shoulder. "Case, look at me." He did. "Case, I want to save Jax. Help me save Jax. I promise I won't run." At least not until I'd done everything I could for the injured boy. After all, I'd inflicted the wound with my ninja skills, as my boys would say. Case seemed to snap out of his shock and started rooting around in his brother's jeans pocket. He came out with a small key. Jax moaned in apparent protest, but we both ignored him. Case gave me the key like an obedient child. I slid it right into the padlock that held the chain onto the metal ring in the wall, and it took me a minute to unwrap the chain from around my ankle. I started to stand, but Case stopped me, grabbing my arm. His eyes pleaded with me. "I'm just going to wash my hands, Case. I'll be right back." He released his grasp, and I quickly walked to the sink, praying water would come out. I turned the knob and heard a sputtering noise, like my old 1980 Cougar used to make when I turned the key, right before it came to life. I held my breath. Water started to trickle out of the spigot, and I exhaled with relief. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. I washed the blood off my hands and dried them on the cleanest part of my pants. It was the best I could do. As I walked back to the boys, I took off my jacket. I didn't even want to think about the condition of my new favorite item of clothing. I laid it carefully over the sneeze guard, hoping it could be saved, too. I returned to Case and Jax and kneeled. "Take off your shirt, Case," I instructed. He looked at me with total confusion. "I need a clean bandage for the wound. Give me your shirt." I wasn't sure how clean it was, but it would have to do. He quickly took off his shirt and handed it to me. Now I needed something to clean the cut, and Case needed something to do. "Case, is there any alcohol here?" He looked around, not really comprehending what was going on. "Not in here, Case. Out there." I pointed out the door. "Do you have any alcohol? Not beer, but whiskey." The mention of whiskey registered with him, and he stood, but hesitated, looking at me for more instruction. He was like a puppy learning to fetch the Sunday paper. "Go get the whiskey, Case, as fast as you can. Run!" He left the little shack in a flash. Turning back to my patient, I started to tear up the white T-shirt while I assessed the wound. When I was satisfied with my strips of cloth, I slowly, carefully began to remove the soiled rag that was currently loosely wrapped around Jax's thigh. He moaned. Thank God. He was still with us, but barely. The cut my boot heel had made was jagged and ugly. I thought of my purse, my favorite yellow handbag full of useful items that I'd left in the front seat of Rip's car at the bridge. I always kept a small bottle of Manuka honey in there for emergencies. It was the best natural antibiotic for cuts, and with 4 boys, I had used it on a regular basis. I also thought of the lip balm I never went anywhere without. My lips were so dry they hurt. I silently cursed the unofficial rule that an FBI agent must be unencumbered. In other words, no purse. Why did it have to be so difficult to be a woman sometimes? Case came tearing in the door with a half-empty bottle of single malt whiskey in one hand. He knelt next to me, handing me the liquor, but looking nervously at his brother. The bottle didn't have a lid. "Have you two been drinking, Case?" I asked, my mother tone really coming through. He looked at me and shook his head. "No, ma'am, not today." "Good boy." I handed the bottle back to him. "Take a swig. You need it," I told him. He gave me a half grin and complied. Then he gave the bottle back to me. I took a small swig myself, for courage, and then poured a generous amount on the cut. Jax made a horrible noise, like a cow going to slaughter, but then relaxed. I poured a little more, and this time he barely flinched. I rubbed a little whiskey between my hands and went to work rebandaging his thigh. I was pretty happy with my wrap job, but this boy wasn't out of the woods yet. I was afraid I hadn't gotten to him soon enough. His eyes were closed now, and his breathing was very faint and shallow. Maybe he had lost too much blood. I racked my brain, but could only come to one conclusion. He needed a doctor. "Case, you have to take him to the hospital." Case suddenly found his voice. "What? But didn't you just save him?" "I did what I could, but he's lost a lot of blood, and he needs fluids." Case picked up the whiskey bottle from where I'd set it on the floor and put it to his brother's lips. "We'll just give him a drink." He was desperate. "Case, he's unconscious. You have to take him to the hospital or he'll die." Case sat on the floor and hung his head, letting the bottle fall out of his hand. It rolled to the wall and stopped. The sound reminded me of something else hitting the floor and sliding. The gun. Shit. I'd gotten so wrapped up in saving this kid I'd nearly forgotten my escape plan. Case was crying now. I felt bad for these 2 boys and wondered how they'd ended up here. My maternal instincts were too strong to dissuade. I mentally made a change to my plan. "Come on, Case. We'll take your brother to the hospital together. Do you have a car?" I stood and, as casually as I could, sauntered over to the corner. My foot hit something and I bent over to pick it up. The gun felt so good in my hand I paused for a second, but startled at the sound of Case's voice and quickly put the firearm in my empty holster. I was fairly sure I no longer needed it, but just in case we ran into any trouble outside. Jabba's gonna kill us. All we had to do was watch you while they were gone. Gone? They were gone. Perfect. Time for us to go too. Case, we need to go now. Do you have a car? He just sat there looking at the floor between his legs. I crouched down and forced him to look me in the eyes. He looked much younger to me now than he had when I'd first sized the two of them up. How old are you? I asked, not able to keep the compassion out of my eyes. He gazed back at me as if the only thing he wanted in the world was someone to care about him. My plan had worked a little too well. 17. Just 3 years older than Levi. I tried to justify why I had encouraged a minor to drink whiskey, but it just made my temple throb. I needed to focus. I pulled him to his feet and hastily removed the gun from the front of his pants, but he didn't even seem to notice. I hoped he didn't have any hidden weapons that could get him in trouble. I slid his pistol's barrel halfway down the back of my pants, flinching as it scraped my bruised tailbone. Case took a deep breath in through his nose and then turned to me. I'll get the keys. I hoisted Jax up as gently as I could, but all those muscles, and the fact that he was dead weight, were very heavy. I half carried him outside and had to squint for a few seconds while my eyes adjusted to the sunshine. Then I saw the car. No way. A 1980 red and white Cougar, my baby from high school, but it couldn't actually be mine since my first car had become scrap metal after the engine block froze. Still, I couldn't help but smile. I made my way to the car and noticed on the way that we were at an abandoned track of some kind. I vaguely remembered something about an old Greyhound racing track just outside of town that had closed over 8 years ago, before Trevor and I had moved there. The track was still pretty much intact, and the small concessions shack I had been chained to was just outside the old main entrance. The car was parked in the VIP parking spot just 20 feet from both. I reached the old beauty and laid Jax in the back seat. I buckled both seatbelts over him as best I could, and then checked his pulse. Weak, but there. Hang in there, kid. Case appeared, running toward me from the old box office directly in front of the car, keys in hand. He started to get in the driver's seat, but I headed him off. Oh, no, you don't. You've been drinking. I snatched the keys from him and climbed behind the wheel. As he ran around to get in the passenger side, he threw his arms in the air. So have you, lady. He got in and I put the key in the ignition. Yeah, but at least I'm legal. He didn't have a retort for that. I turned the key and the car purred to life like a very happy kitten. Definitely not my car. As I fastened my seatbelt, I noticed Case wasn't doing the same. Put your seatbelt on. When it was clear the car wasn't moving until he did as I commanded, he reluctantly buckled his seatbelt. I put it in reverse and backed out of my VIP parking spot. Then I slammed on the accelerator and sped out of there. I was a woman on a mission. I had 2 juvenile delinquents and possibly runaways in the car. One was sitting next to me, and his brother, nearly dead due to an injury I gave him, was bleeding in the back seat, while I prayed their crime boss, the jackass who kidnapped me, and his muscle-bound henchman wouldn't pass us on the road. I had never felt more alive.
You're listening to Big World Network.